It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck. And of course, as always, that means some smart talk radio in this segment. Looking forward to this one. We're going to be talking to a real Southern belle, and she's turning red as I say that. We're going to be talking to Holly Tucker. She's a professor of French and biomedical ethics and society at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. She lives there, and she also lives in France part-time. She's the author of Blood Work, a Los Angeles Times Book Prize finalist, amongst other works, but a brand new work by Holly called City of Light, City of Poison, Murder, Magic, and the First Police Chief of Paris. Should be an interesting conversation indeed. Holly, how are you, Miss Holly?
I'm doing well, thank you. How's that for my Southern accent for you?
Well played. Well played. Let's find out, let's share with our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit more about Holly Tucker. First of all, biomedical ethics. Tell us a little bit about that. And then what led you to pen the work City of Light, City of Poison?
Well, I go at this as someone who studies the culture and literature and art of any given society, and I've picked as my target, and that's what I've been working on all of my life as an academic, is on early French culture. So between the 16th and 18th centuries. And the first question that I often get is, how in the world, does somebody who has an appointment in French at Vanderbilt also have an appointment at the medical school? And what it turns out that there's a lot of interest in understanding the longer history of medicine, understanding how the notion of ethics and the process by which people, make really important decisions around care of others, care of themselves, end of life issues. It's a very interesting dialogue that I get to have with people who are in the Center for Biomedical Ethics. And it links up to my research directly. My last book, as you mentioned, Blood Work, was specifically on all of the controversies that were swirling around blood transfusion in the 17th century. That's when the first blood transfusions were done. There was also murder involved in there, and there was a fair bit of investigation and detective work I needed to do to solve that mystery. And then this latest book really gets, for me, at some core ethical questions, particularly in regard to interrogation techniques and then also torture. Because the story that I'm telling in City of Light, City of Poison is really dark, and it gets at fascinating questions about what do you do in a society that doesn't have a police force, that begins to set up its police force, and then the chief of police ends up finding out that the king's life is in danger because there are threats of poisoning. And so what do? You start to interrogate, and how far will those interrogations go? So you can see those are sort of the larger ethical dimensions that I try to tackle being a French professor, and it is very weird to have those two hats, I can tell you.
What about, when we think about Paris, there's a wonderful bright side, but as you said, you sort of sense there's always this sort of dark undercurrent, at least in its history. Tell us a little bit about, Louis XIV, and he, at some point, again, appoints, so to speak, a sheriff, so to speak, or at least a chief of police, and tell us what prompted him to do that and what was his motivation behind all of that.
Well, the first thing we associate with Louis XIV, right, is the Sun King, the divine monarchy, Versailles, that extraordinary palace. And we imagine France in all of its amazing pomp and glory. But at the same time, Louis XIV had to deal with the fact that if he wanted to be king of the world, he needed to clean up Paris, because Paris was considered to be, in the 17th century and long before that, the crime capital of the world. It was dirty, it was disgusting, it was noisy, it was dangerous, and at night it was dark. People really were afraid to venture out into the streets. Add to it that guns, the technology in guns had shifted to such a degree that it was easier to have pistols and it was easier to carry concealed weapons. So you really were taking your life into your own hands when you went out into the streets. So Louis XIV decides, after actually two embarrassing things happened. First, a criminal lieutenant who's in charge of prosecuting crimes and prosecuting criminals is murdered in broad daylight in his own home in 1665. And a few months later, the civil lieutenant, also one of the chief ministers in the courts, was also killed. He died under very, very suspicious circumstances that it was later determined that he was poisoned. So Louis XIV says, this is an embarrassment. I need to take care of it. So he appoints Nicolas de la Reynie, to clean up the city. And if we call Paris the City of Lights now, it's because La Reynie, the police chief, the new police chief, there was never really a police force to speak of, decides to light the streets. Big lanterns. He designs these huge lanterns, and within a year, Paris had a reputation of being the city of light.
Holly, why Paris necessarily? And let me reframe that. Why do we think of and why do we think of Paris though as being a place where crime was necessarily rampant? As one of the quotes at the beginning of, I believe, chapter 1 was, "They kill day and night here," or "They kill here day and night." Why Paris versus London versus Berlin versus anywhere else?
Well, London had its own very big problems. In 1665, right, London had faced the plague. It had faced the Great Fire. So London was in a state of utter destruction in the late 17th century, and also a state of rebuilding. So I really don't know much about criminal statistics in some of the major European cities, but I do know that it's part of sort of this nationalist drive and urge for all of the European leaders to really set their country apart. London is in a state of rebuilding, but it is also the English are going out and colonizing and exploring and tapping other countries in an effort to build its reputation as an empire, and so is France, and so is Spain, right, as well as the Portuguese. So it's not a unique concern. I think that's a really good question. It's not a unique concern, but I think it's an especially pressing concern for a king like Louis XIV, who really wants to have these ostentatious shows of personal greatness.
You just joined. Sorry, go right ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to remind people you're listening to Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck, and our special guest, Holly Tucker. She's a professor in the Department of French and Italian, as well as the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University. Multiple times author, brand new work called City of Light, City of Poison, Murder, Magic, and the First Police Chief of Paris. Holly, as you did research on this, well, I mean, I'm sure there were multiple surprises, but what jumped out at you as something about, wow, I didn't even really consider that, or this is a factor, these are some things going on here that I don't think anyone can imagine?
I think that what struck me as I was researching this book, and also while I was writing it, is just how crazy the story is, to such a degree that you almost think that it has to be fiction, but it's true. I mean, how could one imagine that there's a whole cabal of poisoners, rogue priests, also people who say that they're witches, working in the area just 10 minutes away from the Louvre? How could one imagine, as well, as that some of the most prominent members of Louis XIV's court were actually going to those neighborhoods to buy love potions, to buy poison, which they would call inheritance powders, to have spells performed for love and for murder. how could, I mean, what really, I guess, at one point that just completely stunned me is that at Notre Dame, the most amazing cathedral, poisoners were actually meeting up with their noble clients and passing poison to them, right? And so there were really dark deals that were going on in some of Paris's most extraordinary churches. There were also odd, dark, Eucharist-like ceremonies that were being performed as well, that sound an awful lot like magic and witchcraft, again, in places like Notre Dame and other churches that many of your listeners have probably visited. And still, it's true. So I think that's the biggest thing. Is each time I thought, I can't. This is wow. I would dig back into my archives, into my manuscripts, into all of the documents that we still have left on this, and I would be able to confirm it through number of eyewitness accounts, right? That's the biggest thing that surprised me, is just how much history can be so unbelievable as to seem like fiction.
So, Holly, my assumption is that the reason people used arsenic, and as you mentioned, even Spanish fly, which we think of really as an aphrodisiac, as they poison people versus shooting them or stabbing them, much harder to detect, much harder to prove, I would think, a crime is committed. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, it was. Arsenic's a horribly wonderful poison, right? Because it's odorless, it's colorless, and in small doses, it doesn't kill right away. So it's easy enough to be able to just over time, add a few drops of liquid arsenic in a person's food, and then they'll start to have digestive problems, which will turn into larger medical issues. And so just, at a time that we don't have anesthesia, we don't have antisepsis, we don't really even know much about germ theory we know nothing actually about germ theory at this point. It just looked like the natural course of life. As you get sick and then you die. There were other things that could be done too. Is powdered arsenic could actually be put in to clothes. So you ship as a noblewoman, you would ship the laundry out to the help to wash and iron them, sprinkle a little bit of stuff in there, and then you get skin lesions. And interestingly, if you put the poison on pants, they start to look, and they're in the area of the private parts, it starts to look like a rash around there. And so where sexually transmitted diseases were rampant, okay, well, the husband's been cheating, and then he dies. Well, he got what he deserved. Oh, that poor woman, right? The poor widow, when really she was the one who had a hand in his death. Wow.
So how, Holly, again, as we talk about murder magic and the first police chief, how successful were his efforts, and sort of how were they measured, and were people celebrating, or did they care?
Oh, this was the big scandal of the 17th century in France, to such a degree that Louis XIV decided to create a secret court so that the inner workings of the investigation and then also the court proceedings and judgment and later tortures were out of the public eye. But all of Paris was attuned to this. The police chief, Nicolas de Remy, moved back and forth from his home near the Louvre, Châtelet, the prison near the Louvre, and then to the dungeon where over 200 prisoners were kept near the Château de Vincennes. Daily, he would move there to do his interrogations at the Château de Vincennes, and increasingly, as rumors started to accumulate about the secret trials, and then especially as some of the nobility were brought in for interrogation, the king and his ministers actually had to budget for greater support and protection for the police chief, because there were so many angry, scared people that who could be next. I mean, in the end, they arrested over 400 people, right? Put over 200 people on trial, and then at least 30 people were executed for this. And at every stage, especially in the latter part of this this moment in French history, many of those people were people of the nobility of the greatest heights, including one or more of Louis XIV's own mistresses.
Well,
so it was not ignored.
Yeah. Well, again, one of the things that struck me was the seemingly large number of convicted conspirators that were women. Talk about that just a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, that's something I struggled with. There were a fair number of men, but it all began with the women, and I think that played into cultural stereotypes, right? Is many of the poisoners were also midwives, and midwives, ever since time eternal, had been considered to both be caregivers, but also, if they were not of the right moral character, they could also be advocates for the darker arts because they knew secrets, right, about life and love and reproduction and birth, which is the most mysterious thing. I would even, the most marvelous and mysterious thing I would even say now. Midwives were frequently accused of also, just as they help women to have their children, is knowing secrets to keep them from being pregnant or to stop a pregnancy that was unwanted. So midwives were frequently associated with these darker arts, and I also do think that there's this fear of, even though women didn't have the same rights as men in early French society, there's this fear of this all-powerful woman who could really do horrible things to overturn the family structure, which was, of course, led by the man. So there's this, I think that taps into this great fear, but at the same time, there are a few very well-placed noblemen who were accused, as well as, people in the circle of the main witches and rogue priests and abortionists. But there again, it's very interesting because as the nobility starts to become increasingly implicated in this scandal, it becomes evident as well is that it was a really lovely way to be able to get rid of one's competition in Louis XIV's court by accusing them of being involved in this. So it's very expedient at all levels, both in regard to gender, but also in regard to politics. There's a lot of nasty people who had a lot of really dark things that they wanted to accomplish at this time of the scandal.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Again, we're with Holly Tucker. She's a professor at Vanderbilt University, also an author. Brand new work called City of Light, City of Poison, Murder, Magic, and the First Police Chief of Paris. Holly, as we kind of start to wind down here just a little bit, maybe kind of what's the headline out of all of this as you look back on this and summarize maybe what you learned and what we would all learn, so to speak, without giving away too much. What do we learn from all this, and how does this change our perspective on things at all?
Well, I think for me, it's a character, it's a real life character because this is nonfiction. But the character that fascinated me the most is the police chief, and that's why there are many ways that I could have structured this, and that's why I chose Nicolas de la Reynie as my main person, because he starts out as a really upstanding guy. He wants to be able to clean up Paris. He's attending to the populace's needs. The streets are disgusting, is to start to clean those up, both for comfort and also for the good health of the citizenry. He's dedicated to the king. I mean, he really does believe in the good cause. And what's interesting to me, and it comes out really clearly in the archives and the manuscripts that I was working with, is that he really faces a moral crossroads. He knows that there's now so much darkness in the souls of human beings, more than I think he ever anticipated. But how far is he willing to go to be able to find and extract the truth? And there are moments where that fine stand-up guy that we meet at the beginning of the book really shifts and becomes almost as bad as the people that he is trying to track down. And I think that's, for me, the takeaway point, is in moments of great turmoil in a society. I think all of us, even in our noble intentions, all of us have the ability, if we don't constantly check our core and our ethical sense of how we live in life, is that things can shift really quite quickly, right? All for the good cause.
Well, again, the work, City of Light, City of Poison, author Holly Tucker. It is a fascinating read. Indeed, it's historical, but it almost reads like a novel. It's a good one indeed. Holly, how can people find out more about some of the research in your previous works and also pick up a copy of this one?
Well, the book is available pretty much in every bookstore. So, on the typical online sites. I'm always happy to hear from readers. My information to contact me is holly-tucker.com. And there's a way to just shoot an email if there's anything that readers have found interesting or they want to know more about. And then on Facebook, I have an author page, which is Holly Tucker. That's the best thing I love about being a professor who writes these type of books. So I see this as the ultimate opportunity for me to be able to take what I've been researching and what I teach about in my classrooms and be able to engage with people outside of my own university, even people who have been out of the university for a long time and just really want to interact and learn neat things. So I would encourage anybody to get a hold of me.
Well, appreciate your time today. Appreciate the work, and we would love to have you back on again.
Well, I'm working on the next one, so who knows? That would be really nice. Thank you for having me.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis.